The lights dimmed slightly as the audience roared with excitement. Keanu Reeves stepped onto the stage, his signature black suit flowing smoothly as he waved humbly to the crowd. A calm presence, quiet but magnetic, he carried himself with that familiar aura, cool, collected, and slightly mysterious. Jimmy Kimmel stood to greet him with his usual grin, extending a hand while welcoming him to the show. The applause continued for a few more seconds before the two sat down across from each other. Jimmy leaned in slightly, an amused look on his face, and opened with a joke. "Ladies and gentlemen, the man, the myth, the assassin, and apparently the nicest guy in Hollywood," he said, drawing laughs from the audience. Keanu chuckled politely, nodding along. The energy in the room was high, but something subtle shifted as Jimmy kept speaking. "Keanu, I gotta ask, do you ever worry you're becoming too silent in your roles? I mean, in John Wick 4, you had what, 300 words? That's almost one per kill." The audience laughed again, but Keanu's smile faded slightly. His eyes narrowed just a touch, not enough to be obvious to everyone watching, but just enough for those paying attention. Jimmy went on, "I'm serious though. You've kind of become the king of quiet brooding. Is it a creative choice or do you just hate dialogue?" Another round of laughter. Keanu maintained a calm posture, but he adjusted in his seat, pausing before answering. "I think sometimes silence speaks louder than words," Keanu replied, his tone neutral but firm. The crowd clapped lightly. Jimmy, sensing the tension, tried to lighten it up. "Oh come on, don't be like that, I'm just messing around. We love you, man." Keanu nodded again, but his eyes said something else. There was a flicker of irritation, quickly buried under his usual stoic mask. The playful tone of the conversation had started to wobble, the energy subtly shifting from warm to wary. Jimmy reached for another joke, this time referencing an older meme about Keanu being sad, or deep, in real life. "You ever smile off camera, or is brooding just your thing full-time?" The audience chuckled again, some unsure whether to laugh or not. Keanu didn't respond immediately. He tilted his head slightly, maintaining eye contact with Jimmy. There was no smile. "Do you always mock your guests for being different?" he asked softly, yet with a pointed edge. The crowd's laughter died down. The atmosphere grew still, like the air before a thunderstorm. Jimmy seemed caught off guard but forced a smile, waving it off as part of the show. Keanu leaned back, crossed his arms, and waited for the next question, his demeanor calm, but the tension in the studio undeniable. Jimmy adjusted his position slightly in the chair, clearly noticing the awkward air that had begun to settle after Keanu's calm but cutting remark. Still trying to regain the playful vibe of the segment, he forced a chuckle and leaned forward. Okay, Jimmy said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, maybe that was a bit much. But seriously, you've done so many action films now, guns, swords, nunchucks, horses, do you ever worry people might stop taking the story seriously and just focus on the body count?" Keanu blinked slowly, maintaining eye contact. His hands were resting on his knees, posture still and deliberate, like a man who was choosing patience over impulse. "That's an interesting way to look at it," Keanu said after a beat. His voice was calm, but there was a controlled tightness in it. "I think people see different things in a story. Some see violence, some see pain, some see redemption. I try to bring truth to all of it." The audience responded with a few thoughtful claps, but the mood had definitely shifted. Jimmy gave a half smile. Still not quite reading the room right. "But do you think maybe we've hit the point where killing 300 guys in a suit isn't storytelling, it's just, stylish murder?" The words hung in the air. The camera panned slightly to catch Keanu's reaction in close-up. He didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. But his jaw tightened, and his lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not funny," Keanu said, quietly but with unmistakable gravity. The studio fell into an uneasy silence. A few audience members laughed nervously, unsure if it was part of a scripted moment. Jimmy raised his eyebrows, pretending to be surprised. "Whoa, didn't mean to strike a nerve there," he said, trying to play it off. Keanu's stare didn't break. "You're mocking something you don't understand," he said firmly. "John Wick isn't about killing for fun. It's about loss, about consequences, about pain. Maybe you missed that." The tension now was almost physical, like the entire studio was holding its breath. Jimmy, caught off guard by the seriousness, shifted uncomfortably. "Okay," he muttered, holding up his hands in mock surrender, didn't expect a philosophy lecture. The audience didn't laugh. Keanu's gaze didn't soften. There was a beat of silence, thick and heavy. Then Jimmy cleared his throat, pretending to move on. Alright, let's talk about something lighter, he said, glancing at his notes. I heard you brought your motorcycle collection to the set. That's cool, right, but it was too late. The spark of friction had already been lit. The warmth had vanished. Jimmy's jokes now sounded like filler, and Keanu's presence had shifted from guest to unmovable force. The confrontation hadn't exploded yet, but it was brewing. Everyone in the room could feel it. Jimmy fidgeted slightly in his chair, attempting to shake off the heavy tension that had gripped the studio like a vice. He let out a small laugh, clearly forced, and said, "Okay, so we're not joking about John Wick tonight." Got it. He glanced toward the audience, fishing for a chuckle, but the response was subdued. Keanu remained motionless, his face unreadable, eyes focused straight ahead. Jimmy shifted gears, trying to find familiar ground again. "So tell me," he began, tapping the card in his hand, "you've played Neo, John Wick, Johnny Mnemonic, is there a character you don't want to play? Maybe someone who actually talks?" That got a small wave of laughter from the crowd, but Keanu didn't flinch. Instead, he offered a measured reply. "I choose characters based on the story, not the word count." His tone was even, but cool. "I think there's depth in silence. Maybe that's hard to understand when you live off punchlines." The remark landed with a sharp edge, cutting through the shallow laughs that had just started to rise. Jimmy raised his eyebrows in mock shock, exaggerating his expression. "Wow, okay, that felt personal," he said, sitting back with an exaggerated sigh. "I guess someone didn't take their chill pill today." Keanu leaned forward slightly, not smiling. "You invited me here to talk about my work. If you're not interested in that, maybe I shouldn't be here." The audience's gasps were audible now. A few phones had started to record. This wasn't going the way anyone expected. Jimmy, ever the showman, couldn't help himself. "Oh come on, Keanu," he said with a smirk. "Don't be so sensitive. It's just a talk show. We make fun of everyone. Even Tom Cruise gets roasted." "But you're not making fun of Tom Cruise," Keanu replied, his voice low and firm. "You're mocking what I believe in. You're making a joke out of pain, trauma, loss, things I've spent years trying to explore through my work. Maybe that's funny to you. It's not to me." The crowd had fallen silent again. The air inside the studio was tense, brittle. Jimmy blinked, caught off guard by the level of emotional sincerity in Keanu's voice. He attempted one last quip to wrestle back control. "I guess we should have brought a therapist instead of a host tonight." That was the final spark. Keanu's eyes narrowed, and his tone shifted from calm to sharp. "Maybe comedians shouldn't critique art they don't understand." His words hit with precision, like a blade. There was a collective hush, a beat of stunned silence, followed by a few gasps. Jimmy tried to laugh it off, but it came out shaky. "Okay, alright, we're doing this. I guess Keanu's not in the mood for fun tonight. And maybe your definition of fun is just disrespect in disguise," Keanu replied without missing a beat. "You laugh at people. I try to speak to them. That's the difference." The audience, now glued to every word, began murmuring. Some clapped, others just sat in stunned silence. Jimmy threw his hands up as if to say, "What do you want from me?" But his confident TV host persona had visibly cracked. The confrontation had now become undeniable, two energies clashing in a way that was both riveting and uncomfortable. And behind the scenes, producers were now frantically whispering to one another, sensing that something had gone seriously off script. Keanu leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed tightly against his chest, the silence between them now so heavy it felt like a third presence on the stage. Jimmy tried to hold onto the shreds of control, forcing a smile, still hoping to steer the conversation back toward safe territory. Okay, he said, chuckling nervously, "I think we've had enough existential philosophy for one night. Let's just take a breath, shall we?" The audience gave a soft, uncertain laugh, unsure of where this moment was headed. Keanu didn't respond. He simply sat, eyes locked on Jimmy, unmoving. Then slowly, Keanu reached up and unclipped the microphone from his collar. The small gesture echoed louder than words. The tension in the room immediately spiked. He placed the mic down on the table, his fingers steady and precise, and then stood up slowly. Jimmy's eyes widened, unsure if this was a bit or a real moment unraveling before millions of eyes. "Wait, what are you doing?" he asked, half laughing, half panicking. Keanu looked down at him, face calm but eyes burning with quiet frustration. "I think I've said everything I need to," he said, voice low but crystal clear. The audience gasped audibly. Phones were lifted in unison, the sea of screens glowing like little windows into a viral moment in the making. Keanu turned slightly toward the crowd, gave a faint nod to the audience, more out of politeness than performance, and then turned to leave. Jimmy, unable to resist one more jab, tried to pull the spotlight back. "All right, folks, give it up for Keanu Reeves, philosopher, warrior, and now, expert in storming off sets." His tone was laced with sarcasm, and he grinned at the audience as if to win them back to his side. That's when Keanu stopped. Right at the edge of the stage, he turned back slowly. His expression wasn't angry, it was disappointed, quietly, deeply disappointed. "You invite people here and then tear them down," he said calmly, but his voice carried like thunder through the silent studio. "That's not comedy, that's cowardice." The room went completely still. Jimmy opened his mouth, but before he could speak, two stage crew members, security, stepped quietly onto the set. Not in a rush, not with force, but with purpose. One gently touched Keanu's elbow, offering assistance, though he didn't need it. The other stood slightly between Jimmy and Keanu, just in case things escalated further. The crowd was now murmuring, some gasping, others recording, a few beginning to applaud slowly, not out of excitement, but out of solidarity. Jimmy tried to brush it off with another joke, but it didn't land. The energy had shifted permanently. This wasn't his stage anymore. It belonged to the moment. Keanu gave one last look around the studio, as if taking in the absurdity of it all, then turned and walked off into the wings, his steps measured and unfazed. The camera stayed on Jimmy for a moment too long, catching him frozen in a smile that had now wilted into discomfort. He shifted in his seat, clearly rattled, flipping his cue cards aimlessly as if trying to remember the next segment. But everyone watching, whether in the studio or from home, knew that nothing after this was going to matter. The show had just been rewritten in real time. Backstage, the echo of Keanu's footsteps faded into the dim hallway as crew members watched in stunned silence. The energy in the air was electric, the kind that buzzes after a lightning strike, sharp, dangerous, unforgettable. Keanu moved swiftly but calmly, his face unreadable. He didn't stop to look at anyone, didn't pause to explain himself. A production assistant holding a clipboard tried to approach, eyes wide, unsure if they should intervene or let him walk. Keanu didn't even glance at them. His presence alone seemed to push everything and everyone aside without a single word. Inside the studio, Jimmy sat awkwardly in his chair, staring into the camera with a look that teetered between embarrassment and disbelief. The audience sat in a stunned hush, some whispering to one another, others clutching their phones, rewatching the moment they had just captured. Jimmy cleared his throat, forced a grin, and tried to recover. "Well," he said with a fake chuckle, "I guess that was intense." Who knew Keanu had such a dramatic exit in him? A few audience members laughed, but it was scattered and uncomfortable. The camera zoomed out slightly, revealing Jimmy trying to move forward. "Coming up next, we have a band that probably won't walk off the stage, unless they're inspired by Neo." Another joke, another weak laugh, but the damage had been done. In the control room, producers were frantically discussing what to cut, what to keep, and how to handle the fallout. Meanwhile, social media was already ablaze. Clips from the show were spreading like wildfire across platforms. The hashtags #Keanu walks out, #Team Keanu, and #Kimmel disrespectful were trending within minutes. Tweets flooded the internet. Keanu standing up for his art, legend. Jimmy Kimmel seriously disrespected him. That wasn't cool. That mic drop moment, iconic. Backstage, a senior producer finally caught up to Keanu near the exit. "Keanu, wait, please, can we talk for a second?" Keanu stopped but didn't turn around. "I said what I needed to say," he replied calmly. "You invite people on your show and treat them like props. I'm not a joke. None of this is." The producer, caught between protecting the show and managing damage control, stammered, "It was just a segment, just jokes." "That's what we do." Keanu turned slowly, looked them dead in the eyes. "Then maybe you need to rethink what kind of show you're doing." He exited through the back door, greeted by a black SUV waiting outside. Paparazzi were already there, snapping frantically. Keanu shielded his eyes briefly but didn't flinch or respond. He got into the vehicle and closed the door softly behind him. As the SUV pulled away, the flash of cameras continued, and reporters began yelling questions. But Keanu didn't react. He simply stared out the window, his reflection flickering against the glass as city lights blurred past. Inside the studio, Jimmy was still trying to laugh it off, bringing out the musical guests early, pretending Everything was fine. But it wasn't. The audience wasn't with him. The comments online weren't either. His charm had faltered, his control had slipped, and in just a few fiery moments, the usually smooth operation of the late-night world had been flipped on its head. By the time the credits rolled, the episode wasn't remembered for its guests or jokes, it was remembered for the man who walked away from it all, holding onto his dignity like armor. That night, every entertainment blog ran the story. Some headlines praised Keanu's composure and strength. Others criticized Jimmy for crossing a line. Interviews and behind-the-scenes whispers began leaking. People wanted to know what really happened. But Keanu, he remained silent. No statements, no tweets, no interviews, just that look, that moment, and a walk-off that would be replayed millions of times in the days that followed.